I appreciate RF giving me an opportunity to come speak about this. You know, we've been trying to do this at each region, so have an opportunity to come in and just give an overview of about abeyance and understanding around how we're implementing this across your enterprise. Typically, when we're live, I ask the question of how many it and just move on where it doesn't go through the enforcement process. So as you can see, there's a lot of value here for these new standards or new standards that get put in place or that are getting more and more complex around understanding that our enterprise is trying to look out and saying, okay, are our entities trying to comply in good faith, and what does that look like? So we'll get into the weeds a little bit more, but that's just the high level overview. And as I said, you know, you can focus on the value of the abeyance. You know, this is a tool that was put into our 5-year assessment supplemental filing last year. So here's a little bit of history. Our performance assessment we got to do every 5 years, and we've got to kind of brag on the regions of what they're doing and what NERC does and our performance of effective oversight. So in our supplemental filing in November last year, we put in the concept of abeyance, and there's some fast tracking of compliance exceptions, but I'm here to speak about abeyance. So for abeyance, so we put that in the supplemental filing. It provides the drafting teams not an out. It provides NERC in the regions to monitor these drafting teams a little bit better and maybe be used during the drafting team process of getting entities to think not about the compliance risk, but the risk to the bulk fire system, not about how they may implement or interpret it, but to understand that we need to mitigate this risk. Let's get a standard out there that is effective and vote it through and put a abeyance period in there and collect information and give feedback. As you can see, that's the compliance risk is what a lot of people focus on when they go to vote in for the drafting team stuff. Like I said, when is it considered? It's currently during the standards drafting process. It's not something that the drafting team drafts up. It's not something that the drafting team pre-assumes or that abeyance will be selected for a project. It's not something that'll be on a SAR form that the people fill out. This is strictly an ERO enterprise decision around how we can assist with the abeyance period or getting a standard passed through the drafting team process. Who determines? Like I said, that was the ERO enterprise. And another thing about this is as we get farther into the weeds around EOP 12, you'll see that it's very clear that it's not for an entire standard. It's not for an entire requirement. We try to break it down to, okay, what piece of the standard requirement or part would really benefit from this abeyance period? What is the sticking point of either interpretation or tools or the complexity or something like that? So that's the background. That's the overview of abeyance and where it is now. Next slide, please. So what's the initial criteria? Because now we know what abeyance may or may not be, and we'll get to more in that in a second. But in our supplemental filing, we got some initial criteria for abeyance consideration. This isn't all of it, and you'll see that it may consider these things. It may be other things, and you'll see a high priority project given the risks addressed. One of the concerns around EOP 12 was it went through the 321 process through the board to get approval because industry did not have enough votes. So a new reliability standard modified, undergoing significant revisions that could apply. And then the attributes, new technology likely to implement, no consensus or best practices, and a high level of technical complexity. So you can see that there's some minimal criteria that we start to look at. It doesn't have to be the only criteria, but it's a starting block in the supplemental filing of exactly what we may be looking at. The current usage, and like I said, this is through the drafting team process currently. The current usage that is the only one out there is for EOP 12. And there's some key things that we want to highlight here on EOP 12. It's for 2 years. That's if FERC approves that by, I think, June 30th. So we're assuming that the standard requirement will be effective October 1st, 2025. So you can see it's defined time period of 2 years. It's requirement 1, part 1. It's very specific, and you'll see with respect to the evaluation of the extreme cold weather temperature. So we understood on this one that if you miss that, then you may miss a lot of other requirements in EOP 12. So this was a perfect candidate where there was a possibility of it cascading because this calculation was incorrect. So next slide. Sometimes it's easier to talk about, okay, what is abeyance? We talked about that. Well, what is it not? Abeyance and abeyance language isn't a reason to write a subpar standard, a crappy standard. Abeyance is there to help through some of the very complex issues and the highly, where people are worried about the compliance risk. It's not a free pass. It's not an extension of the implementation plan. If a standard is effective and enforceable, we will continue to monitor as any other standard. However, there may be some additional questions asked, even if you may be compliant. But that is to collect information around that standard requirement to see if there's still gaps in the standard or if there's other opportunities to enhance the standard for clarification for industry. One of the key things here is industry or the stakeholders shouldn't sit around and wait for that abeyance period to kick in. This is where they should be working very proactive with the regions, with NT-Assist, with the compliance monitoring side at RF, and saying, okay, here's some of the ways we're moving forward. Give us some guidance, right? Talking to your peers. This is the time that you work together and you start to understand, okay, this new standard is coming into effect. How are y'all complying with this? It's very, subjective. We're worried about the compliance piece. Work with your peers, work with your region, and get that feedback. What will happen is, we get questions saying, well, what if I'm not audited during the abeyance period? And that's one of our frequently asked questions. It's, well, if you're not audited and you're not compliant after the abeyance period, you should have been working with the regions. But after the abeyance period, it'll be a PNC just like normal operations. If it's during the abeyance period, you're working with the enforcement staff or you're working with compliance monitoring, and you see it, you find it, and you get information that you may have interpreted it wrong, the standard wrong, then you work with them and you correct it, and it would be going into the abeyance tracker that we have at NERC. Next slide, please. So some of the common questions, and I'll expand on some of these, and hopefully we'll get some through Slido. Will all standards and requirements have an abeyance period? No. This is during the standards drafting process. We get questions about, well, can we look back at other standards and requirements that are currently effective and put abeyance in those? And the answer is no. This will be currently this is a tool that we're using during the drafting process of new standards and requirements for that compliance risk. Where will be the abeyance language be within the standard? That'd be section C, the compliance. If people are familiar with CIP 14, that's where the language was around the data storage of CIP 14 information. So that's where it would be. That's not in an approved section from FERC on the standard. What if I'm not audited on the abeyance period? We just talked about that. And what's interesting about that, we can't lose the fact that entities are expected to be compliant on the effective date of the standard. So don't rely on abeyance period for an auditor to come in. You say, well, we didn't know what to do. That's not going to be good faith of complying with the standard. What current standards and projects have been flagged for abeyance? EOP 12 is the only one that's currently going through with that language that is at FERC. Will the supplemental filing impact the self-logging process? How will abeyance affect that? There will be no impact at all with that. Not at all. Next slide, please. One of the key things from the abeyance period that we need to talk about is the feedback loop and where that information is tracked, how it's tracked. So we will have a tracker for the Euro Enterprise to update if people were around during the COVID and there was COVID exceptions. We will track that. The regions will have an expectation to periodically update that tracker for us, and we'll be monitoring that, providing feedback over to the standards department about what we're seeing in the industry around standards requirements and how people may or may not be missing it, how there were huge hurdles possibly in complying. So we'll be collecting all that in a tracker and providing feedback to the standards. In addition, we'll provide feedback to industry through periodic webinars. So this is the time that pay attention. We're in abeyance period. We'll start to collect information either through the compliance monitoring or enforcement side, and we're going to hold these webinars to give information back to industry around how people may or may not be struggling with the standards that are under abeyance period. This is a great opportunity that even if you're not working with the region, you think you're hitting the mark on everything, you can listen to those abeyance webinars and hopefully get some information about where you're at and if you need to work with the region and move forward and possibly change your approach. So those are the first two questions: standards, possible enhancements. And like I said, it can't be undone. The Enterprise will be working through the RSOL and saying, okay, do we need to add additional questions in the RSOL? Where's the right place to add questions for industry around this abeyance period about, okay, where did they struggle? What's some opportunities for standard development if it has to go back under the SDT? So, you know, there's going to be some opportunities to collect all this information and make sure we collect the right information. Which leads into that third one is, can a SAR be introduced during the abeyance period? Absolutely. We're not going to stop anybody from submitting a SAR, especially if there's a request for interpretation or if there's a reliability gap or people are just struggling and don't quite understand it. And the last question, which, you know, you can see there's no responses, what is good faith? And this is what the ER Enterprise is really not struggling with, but we're addressing and putting some principles documents together around what is good faith. You know, there's always a lot of concern about how the auditors in all the different regions may be consistent around enforcing a good faith type objective standard. This is where we're using our tracker. We'll be looking at the tracker, having internal ER Enterprise conversations around what's captured in that tracker, and looking at that good faith and having a principles document that we share out to our compliance monitoring enforcement staff. Next slide. I think that goes to questions, Michelle. So if there's any questions, it's kind of quick, it's kind of down and dirty, but you know, it's abeyance with standards. It's a new concept. ER Enterprise looks at the projects as they're going through the drafting process, observing comments. Because people ask us, well, when does that get put into place? You know, the ER Enterprise monitors these projects And if we monitor it and we start to see a lot of concern around implementation or interpretation, then that's somewhere we may consider abeyance. But the general rule is this is going to be an exception, not the rule for standards and requirements. So we want to make sure that we use the tool, make sure we use it at the right time, right place.